Billions in infrastructure spending were earmarked for major transportation projects, subways in the provincial capital, highways and light rapid transit elsewhere, all aimed at unclogging key commuter corridors. Then came a pandemic and telecommuting for those jobs that could be done at a distance. It all raises real questions about those earlier spending priorities. With us now for more, in Mississauga, Ontario, Murtaza Haider, Professor of Real Estate Management and Director of the Ryerson Urban Analytics Institute. And in the provincial capital, in East York, Sharina Hussain, Assistant Professor in Brookfield Centre Real Estate and Infrastructure at York University's Schulich School of Business. And in Riverdale, Maddie Simiatiki, Associate Professor, Geography and Planning, and Interim Director of the Schools of Cities at the University of Toronto. It's great to have you three on our program tonight. Let's get right into this because the United States' Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put out guidance saying things such as, in the reopening, people should avoid mass transit, employers should incentivize commuting via single occupancy vehicles, essentially the opposite of what everybody's been telling us to do for the last several decades. After some outcry, they agreed to include things like biking and walking and carpooling with family members only. But mass transit is still not recommended. And I'd like to start by getting your advice on their advice. Maddie, start us off.
Well, this is a real crisis point for our urban transportation systems, and it could go one of two ways. If we end up with transportation systems that are much more dependent on the automobile, we're going to be heading down a path towards greater congestion, greater pollution, more accidents, and greater social inequality for people that don't have access to automobiles. The other alternative is that we find safe ways to provide mass transit. Mass transit has really faced a pandemic paradox at the moment, that costs are rising as they have to do deep cleaning, as they have to lower capacity, and yet it remains a critical lifeline service for many people. So I think we have to continue investing in mass transit. We have to continue to ensure that it's safe and provide other alternatives like cycling and walking for people where it's available. If we go down the path of car dependence, this is going to be really challenging for our cities in the short and long term.
Sharina, what's your advice on the CDC's advice?
Well, I think public transit agencies across Ontario and that in North America are between a rock and a hard place. They have to balance the short-term priorities about ensuring that there's public safety considerations are managed 100%, but also ensuring that they have the financial resiliency in order to sustain the levels of service that many members of the community otherwise come to expect. And that includes having regular access, but also a safe commute. And as Maddie mentioned, that has increased costs, but also has put them to a point in which they don't necessarily have the fare box revenue coming in order to support their operations. So now we start to think about more long-term considerations about building more public transit systems in parallel with the recognition that human behaviors are likely to change quite dramatically. We just don't know how much. It does beg the question of, are we building the right transportation infrastructure today in order to set us up for a post-pandemic future, one in which we might see other pandemics like COVID reemerge from time to time, in which case public transit agencies, from a business model perspective, have to substantially rethink what they otherwise do and how they deliver that service.
Murtaza.
I think it's a question of liability, and if you know that the disease is spreading through close proximity of people being in close concentrations, then you know that you cannot have subways and streetcars and buses tightly packed, or even the platforms with thousands of people crammed together. You take that out of the equation, and it poses an existential threat to the viability of public transit, and also for those who rely on their workers to use public transit to get to work. So the Centers for Disease Control is referring to a realistic threat, and I think from a transit operators, and they also look at their liability issues if they force people into cramped spaces and people get ill. So that's the reason behind the advice. I think what really we need to think about is that transit has to operate on 15 to 40% of its operating capacity for a foreseeable future. And how do we sustain public transit, especially those areas like downtowns that rely on it? But we also know that Ontario is a big province, and outside of Toronto, public transit is not as critical of getting people to their work.
Maddie, you want to pick up on that?
Yes. One of the things that the pandemic has really revealed deep inequalities in our transportation system. During the pandemic, people in the downtown core who have access to cycling and walking in dense neighborhoods, mixed use neighborhoods, have had travel alternatives. In fact, in many ways, it's been in the inner suburbs, racialized communities, communities of color, low income communities where people are working in frontline jobs, having to leave their house every day, and are deeply dependent on public transit. This is where there's been consistent overcrowding and big challenges with people getting around. So as we look to redesign our transit system, we have to be very aware of the inequalities that have built up over time and have been revealed and accelerated during the pandemic.
Well, yeah, Murtaza, this is the thing. Just let's take the Toronto transit system alone. They're providing hundreds of millions of trips every year, hundreds of millions. And if the
Billions.
advice we're getting from our public health people is you really shouldn't be using the subway system anymore because people are too crammed on there, well, what are they supposed to do?
Well, yes. Well, transit systems provide billions of trips. I think Toronto does about 500 million trips every year. The problem is that we have to be prepared for the fact that you cannot be, transit operators will not be able to cram people together. The throughput capacities of public transit systems are going to be compromised until and unless it is declared safe for people to be in close proximity of each other. No one is saying it. No one is willing to accept that kind of responsibility. Maddie's point is right on the money. There's humongous income inequalities, and people who have limited means of transportation rely increasingly on public transit. So there has to be some minimum threshold of public transit operations to be running. But as was pointed out earlier, TTC is looking at $500 million of funding support because their fare box revenue is almost decimated. Their ridership is down by 80 to 90%. So in those scenarios, just keeping these systems alive is going to be a big challenge. Edmonton decided or announced earlier that they don't have the funds to run it, and they may shut down the entire transit system in the summer months. So this is an existential threat for public transit systems, especially for cities, not necessarily for the entire province, but especially for high density cities. This is going to be a big concern.
Yeah, Sharina, can you follow up on that? If in fact, well, we know it's the case, we have empirical data on this. The TTC's ridership is off something like 85% right now, which, when you get most of your revenue from the fare box, is an existential financial crisis. How are they supposed to make it through all that?
Well, it is going to be a challenge. And in the short term, it's very much a function of trying to cut the bleeding where they can, put it frankly. However, when we start looking to like the medium term and the ability to restore confidence on public transit systems, once we begin to reopen our economies, that's when it becomes a question of rethinking how throughput occurs on, say, the TTC system. And that's where we can build upon some of the experiences from around the world. And I'm immediately thinking about some of the experiences in Europe, in which case they've introduced measures in order to stagger ridership demand over the course of the day, not necessarily through changing their service requirements, but also encouraging elements such as public schools and public service areas in order to change their hours of opening in order to ensure that you don't have the issue of peak ridership demand. And that's where we see some of the images pre-pandemic, in which case it becomes a real question of how in the world are we going to be able to operate these public transit systems at the level of trips, but also in a way that minimizes the liability that was mentioned earlier.
Well, that's a neat idea. Maddie, let me suggest another idea to you, and you tell me if this makes any sense. We have, I guess, in the capital city on the books right now, if you think about the Yonge North extension, extending the Yonge subway line up north into York Region, if you think about the Scarborough subway, if you think about the Ontario line going from the CNE to the Ontario Science Centre, not to mention the light rail transit projects planned as well, we've got tens of billions of dollars of infrastructure plans on the books right now. Should that still go ahead?
I think some of the projects should, I think others shouldn't. Everything should be on the table for revisiting. The Ontario line in particular, I think remains a sound investment and a top priority because of the congestion relief on the Yonge line that it provides, and because it serves Thorncliffe and Flemington Park neighborhoods, which have been poorly served by public transit. However, certainly the Scarborough subway and the Eglinton West LRT extension Both of those projects, putting them underground is hugely expensive. Studies before the pandemic showed that those did not provide value for money. And I think now there's a real requirement to revisit those projects and see if bringing them to the surface can save money. We're not saying don't provide public transit. Those communities desperately need public transit, but they would be much better served by a network of surface transportation, bus rapid transit, and light rail lines where it's warranted. That would provide much faster service and much broader coverage for people in the communities.
Okay, but let me ask you the political question, Maddie, as a follow-up here. You're right, in as much as the empirically provable evidence has not really justified the need for the Scarborough Subway or the Eglinton West extension, but there's been a lot of political support behind both of those things for a variety of reasons, but the political support is there. Do you have any reason to believe it's not there anymore?
I would say it's never too late to do the right thing. These projects now make less sense than before, and we've seen old ideas that seemed like they were set in stone before the pandemic start to melt away. For example, putting bike lanes in the city of Toronto, we've seen 40 kilometers of bike lanes approved just in the last month that previously would have were on the books, but would have seemed almost unheard of without debate at City Hall. Those went through City Council very quickly. We've seen other ideas like densifying the suburbs, building complete communities in the suburbs now gaining traction as well. We're seeing whole ideas, ways of thinking are shifting, and now is a moment to revisit those two projects in particular and see if they're still warranted.
Murtaza, let's make a list here. The Scarborough Subway, the Ontario Line, Eglinton West, Yonge Street North Extension. How many of these would you go ahead with? How many would you kill?
I'll kill all but three, all but one. There's only one project that merits consideration, and that's the relief line. It is
That's the Ontario Line.
So my apologies, the Ontario line, the new name. I mean, this has been on the books for 40 years or 50 years, and it has different names. Let's call it the Ontario line. You have to realize these are tough times, and what we have to do is to not stop spending on infrastructure, because a decline in consumption, a decline in spending will lead you to real recession. To avoid that, you have to invest in infrastructure so that you're prepared. But then spending on the right kind of infrastructure is more important than just spending on infrastructure. The Scarborough Subway extension makes absolutely no sense to me. There's almost a unanimous consensus on that this project does not merit all the investments, about $5 billion of investments there. The extension of Yonge University lines to the north would create more problems southbound, because the throughput capacities south of Steeles or south of Finch will not increase if the situation goes back to normal, which means that these are not really well thought out projects. And therefore, one really needs to make sure that in these times of crisis, when money has to be spent, it has to be spent on the right projects. Ontario Line is where you will find the consensus.
Let me introduce a new voice to this conversation, and that is the voice of Adam Giambrone, who many of you will remember was a former Toronto City Councillor, is a former Toronto City Councillor, and a former chair of the Toronto Transit Commission, who wrote the following: COVID-19 has been a catalyst for many people to start working remotely. If proximity to one's job becomes a less significant factor in deciding where to live, there might be a greater appreciation not for the lonely suburbs with their lack of community hubs, but for lively, far-flung villages that offer a smaller scale than today's cities. We could be heading towards a world in which existing city centers and these newfound mini metropolises rise in prominence, while traditional commuter belts fade in popularity as daily commutes become less necessary. Sharina, everybody's trying to figure out what the future looks like. Here's one version. What do you think?
Well, I think it does touch upon some of the trends that we're seeing right now, and that is the recognition that there is a work from home reality that many people didn't think was possible up until 6 months ago. And it does really raise the question of how much of our daily commutes will in fact involve going into the office, or will it mean that we go from one room in our house or a condo to another one? And that's another variable we have to think about when we're planning public transit. What, in fact, will be the likely demand that we can anticipate, rewriting many of the previous business cases that were set in stone prior to the pandemic? However, there is a general consensus that seems to be building that cities will no longer have the degree of prominence that they have. And that's where I would pause and want individuals to stop and think about what are some of the drivers for why people go into cities? Is it very much a function of going to and from the office, or is it more vibrant than that? And there's been a long-standing debate with the advent of new technologies that have said that this will be the death of geography. We can be off in a far-flung place across the country and still have our daily lives occur. However, that has not materialized, and I don't think that will occur in the grand scheme of things. Rather, we're going to begin to see a shift in how we otherwise engage with our daily lives. And that might mean less of a daily commute, but it might still include 1 or 2 trips a week into, say, the downtown core. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind and study quite closely when we start revisiting some of our public transit projects. Do we need them? Maybe, maybe not. But it also raises the question of, do we build the right ones? Do we build it differently? Or can we then introduce new ways of operating existing infrastructure in a way that achieves the functions that we want, recognizing that about 1/3 of human behavior will likely shift permanently after the COVID experience?
Boy, if it's the death of geography, that's terrible news for Matty Simyaticki, who spent his entire academic life teaching it. So let's hope it's not the death of geography. Murtaza, come in on this if you would. In other places, I don't know if you've got studies or data that could help us on this, but in other places where, for example, they have implemented work from home programs, or you don't need to come into the office anymore, we're going to sort of decentralize everything. Did people actually move, as Adam Jambroni is sort of prognosticating here? Did they really move much further away in order to experience a wholly different quality of life from, say, moving from downtown to the inner suburbs to the outer suburbs or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's a question of technology throughout human history, up until maybe 40 years ago. Where people live and where they work was dictated by the prevalent transportation technology throughout human history. As Joel Garreau once wrote, the maximum desirable commute has never been more than 45 minutes. And now with the information technology, we will see an acceleration in these trends. We wrote a report, actually released it last week, on work from home and its prevalence in Canada before and during COVID. And we found out, as per data from Statistics Canada, that right now 40% of the workers, every 2 in 5 workers, is working from home. And in some industries, that number is as high as 70%. These are people who work in knowledge economy, often working in downtowns or high-rise buildings. These people, the work from home prevalence is now in those economic sectors about 70%. Another data set from Statistics Canada revealed that before COVID, there were about 12% of the firms reporting 50% of their workforce were working from home. During COVID, that number jumped to 40%. That is, 40% of the firms reported that more than half of their workforce is working from home. These are monumental shifts in the way we work. The technology has always been there. What we really needed was a crisis. The Arab oil embargo in the 70s allowed people to think about fuel efficiencies, the design of vehicles, fuel economy, corporate fuel economy, and those trends lasted for decades. I mean, the kind of energy efficiency you see in vehicles was started with the Arab oil embargo. I think this is another watershed moment where the things that will change now will not go back to the normal that many people are hoping. It will continue to stay because transportation systems, especially public transit, and also the elevators, getting people up to the 40th, 50th floor, their capacities have been seriously compromised for an unknown period.
Well, Maddie, let me put that to you, because if those numbers do persist, and if dramatically higher percentages of us are continuing to work from home, even once the pandemic, whatever, a year, 2, 3, 4 down the road is under control, I mean, do we need any of these massive investments in public transit going forward?
I think to Sharina's point, it leads us to revisit the types of projects we're building, but I do want to echo her point. I think cities will persist, cities will remain vibrant and critically important. The reason people come together in cities is because there's a huge value to agglomerating. We are social beings. We thrive on being together for business reasons, to trade, for reasons of innovation. We come up with new ideas. We socialize. The hottest places in our cities, the places where people want to be, are where there are other people. And so I think that cities will persist. Now, I think what's interesting is Murtaza mentioned that 4 out of 10 people can work from home. That still means that 6 out of 10 can't. 6 out of 10 are working outside the home. 6 out of 10 continue to need to get to jobs. Now, this doesn't mean that the way that our cities are planned and the types of infrastructure we need won't change. For example, it may be the case that fewer people come into the downtown core as they're working in more regional centers. So that's one potential. And so our transportation systems that have historically been hub and spoke, feeding people into the downtown core, we might revisit some of those projects that are serving that need. The other point is around the type of communities that we build. Even for people that are working from home, they still require the types of services locally and the types of social opportunities to live lives that feel fulfilled. It is very difficult to sit in your house by yourself all day, every day, working remotely. So the types of communities that we're building will still require the types of services, shops, and livelihood and liveliness that make them rich places that people want to be in. I think that we'll continue to see that type of urban planning, even as we revisit the types of infrastructure that we need.
Okay,
Steve,
that's the public
can I
transit debate. Yeah, I hear somebody want to come in. Go ahead.
Yes, Steve, it's according to the Statistics Canada survey, which is a subsample of the labor force survey, 4 out of 10 people are working from home. 2 out of 10 nearly are at home, not working for whatever reason. And those whose commutes are still continuing are 4 out of 10, not 6 out of 10. But the point to remember is that we need to know what we mean by cities. Is it just our 2 square mile vision of downtown of the city, or do we embrace that city is more than just the downtown? It's suburbs, inner suburbs, outer suburbs, and that outer suburbs like Markham and Mississauga and Brampton and Ajax. These are places that are also cities, and having this work from home will allow people to be in communities like Guelph, to be in communities like Barrie, Ontario, still be productive members of the society, because going back to that normal, that pre-COVID normal, means you will have no chance in hell solving the traffic congestion problem or the housing affordability problem. But working from home gives you a decent chance to address at least partially these 2 challenges, housing affordability and traffic congestion. So just to fact that we believe that man is a social animal, when that quote came out, the population of Athens was just about 5,000, not 7-10 million people. So there's a limit to how much socialization we need, and also to assume that suburbs have no civilization, or suburbs have no socialization, or remote suburbs are devoid of life would be a mistake. We have to think strategically about the whole urban system, about the entire urban system or entire provincial system when we think of mobility, when we think of work, when we think of how people commute. Because even in the Greater Toronto area, only about 20% or 23% of the people commute by public transit. The rest don't. So you realize that where we have the highest supply of efficient public transit, even then we get to less than 25% of the people commuting by public transit. Transit is critical for downtown Toronto. 70% of the people who arrive in downtown Toronto for work in the morning peak hours arrive by public transit. There's no denying in it. But there's more to Toronto, there's more to Ontario than downtown.
All right, that's the transit situation. I do want to spend some time now talking about roads, because last month, the federal and provincial governments announced that they would spend a lot of money to widen the 401 from 6 lanes to 10, just west of here in the Cambridge area. And here are some of the things that they said would be achieved by doing so. They said all of this would relieve congestion, it would shorten commute times, it would create jobs, make the highway safer, and improve the quality of life for people living in the region. I'd like to get a sense from all of you as to, and Shireen, why don't you go first on this? How much of any of that is true?
Well, history has shown us that there's this old adage known as build it and they will come. And that's the concept of induced demand. By virtue of introducing greater capacity at a low or at zero cost, that will allow individuals to rethink their commuting behavior. And that might mean that they might choose to get on the 401 in this particular segment more often than not, recognizing that's added capacity. The impact could be over time that there will be more congestion on the added roadways, and that can result in the opposite effect of longer commutes, more congestion, and not otherwise achieving those productivity benefits at hand. However, leaving that aside, there are so many other variables at play here. That being, how often will someone get into their vehicle on a daily basis? Recognizing that we just talked about the work from home aspect, in which case not everyone is going to getting their car and going to the office every single day. Another element relates to the commercial throughput that happens on the 401, in which case this could be adding more capacity for cargo going across those borders and throughout Canada. So these are some other things we have to think about, but it does generally historically mean that the benefits that have been proposed associated with that project may not necessarily pan out 100%.
Yeah, Maddie, we're talking billions of dollars here to add more road capacity. You saw the list of all of the things that the federal and provincial governments promised would eventuate as a result of this. How much of it is true in your view?
I completely agree with Sharina. The phenomena of induced demand has been well studied, that the roads, the added capacity will fill up very quickly. It could encourage people to live further away and commute further. It could also have impacts on the land use patterns and lead to lower density developments further away from places of work. So for all of those reasons, I think this project will have short-lived benefits. Now, there is the one wrinkle in this case is that this is such an important commercial thoroughfare. So in that sense, there may be benefits to providing additional capacity, but I think we should really be focusing on managing demand, providing other alternatives. It's also important to note that that Metrolinx is going to be providing two-way all-day go service to that part of the region, and which is costing billions of dollars to include as well and add as well. And this could actually undermine the viability of that investment. So I think really coordinating our investments and, as a general principle, expanding highways across the region will really be counterproductive economically and to achieve our climate change goals as well.
Murtaza, I wonder if there are a couple of reasons, though, in support of this extension of the highway. Number one, the commercial aspects that Maddie just described and Sharina. And the other thing would be if we're being told by public health officials that we're going to need more single car driving going on because they're urging people not to use public transit as much, is that another good reason to extend the size of the 401 in that location?
Absolutely. I mean, in 1969, I think the average annual daily traffic was around 25,000 in that stretch of the highway in Cambridge. And then now it's about, in 2016, 170,000. It's a sevenfold increase, about 150,000. And this has been throughout the region. I mean, first of all, let me say, the induced demand is very poorly understood. If you believe in induced demand, then you also believe that building more hospitals create more disease, because as you build more hospitals, the number of hospitalizations increase. So what you really realize, it's not induced, it's a poorly understood concept. There's an unmet demand for mobility that is met by increasing the throughput capacity of the highway systems. And induced demand means that someone who had absolutely no interest in driving saw a lane and decided to buy a car and start driving. The people drive to work. The transportation demand is a drive demand. It's not people don't drive aimlessly. So if you believe in induced demand, then you also believe building more hospitals lead to more hospitalization. Having said that, you have to realize that in that part of Ontario, mobility by car is the only viable alternative. And people do not have fixed destinations. The origin destination of people, where they live, where they work, where they go for shopping, in outer parts, in the other parts of Ontario, like Cambridge and other parts, it cannot be served efficiently by public transit. People don't go from one destination to another destination. The other point is that if you take Highway 401 from Windsor all the way to Quebec and then add Autoroute 20 to it, half of Canada lives around it, right? Highway 401 and Autoroute 20. And if you look at your economic corridor from Quebec City to Montreal to Toronto to Windsor, that is where your entire economy, a bulk of your economy moves on trucks. So reducing or not increasing the throughput capacity. The fact is, I don't buy the argument, as they said, that it will reduce congestion. That's not the real purpose of increasing the lane width. The real purpose of increasing the lane width is to increase the throughput capacity of the roadway or highway systems, without which the kind of prosperity that we have would not exist. Highways are not just about people driving, and highways are also about the way our economy moves. And regardless if we like it or not, if you bought it, a truck brought it. That is a reality, and choking that economic lifeline would not be in the best interest of anybody.
Well, having said that, the number one explanation, Maddie, that the government of Ontario and the government of Canada put for building this highway extension is to relieve congestion. Why do governments consistently put that forward as an idea when the empirical data suggests It doesn't relieve traffic congestion, it just creates more of it.
It's such a seductive idea. Build a bigger highway and you'll alleviate congestion. And it appeals to huge commuter belts, which are also very important political constituencies. However, I think we should be very clear. If the public health guidance is that we should be using and encouraging single occupancy vehicles, this will be a disaster for long-term public health. It will create additional air pollution, which causes huge amounts of respiratory disease. It will cause congestion that strangles our cities and our economies. It will undermine the vitality of our communities as cars take over spaces that could be used for other uses, and it will lead to social exclusion of people that don't have access to automobiles. I think this notion that public health can be resolved by encouraging a single occupancy vehicle is a very short-term way of thinking. And the challenge is that if we put it in place now, these behaviors and these trends may continue long after the pandemic is over, especially if we reinforce it with the type of infrastructure we're building. And finally, around climate change, we have very significant climate change challenges, and single occupancy vehicles, transportation is among the highest emitters of greenhouse gas in Canada. And so I think we really need to be focusing on providing alternatives that are safe in the short term, but provide long-term alternatives to people so that they can get around in modes of travel other than the single occupancy car.
Okay, we are literally down to our last minute here, so let me give 20 seconds for each of you to give some advice to our decision makers in terms of priorities for infrastructure going forward during the course of this pandemic. Murtaza, start us off here, 20 seconds on what the priorities ought to be.
We are trying to reopen our economy and our society. We have two paths forward. We can go back to the pre-COVID traffic congestion and housing unaffordability challenges, or we seriously focus on working from home and see if it provides us a decent chance of addressing congestion, addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and also allowing people to live in places where they can afford to rent or buy.
Sharina.
I would add to that by saying, first and foremost, study human behavior. We're seeing short-term patterns, but also longer-term behaviors are beginning to shift. Study that carefully, because that will shift not only the type of infrastructure we're building, but how we build it and what that will look in the long term. And second, think about infrastructure as a network. Introducing the work from home policy means we have to introduce other forms of infrastructure, such as broadband capabilities across a broader network other than downtown cores. These are things that have to be thought in tandem, other than just transportation infrastructure as a silo.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I think they said the other day 12% of Ontarians have no access to good internet right now, which really leaves them far behind. Sorry, Maddie, I'm not taking your time. You put a bow on it for us and finish this off here.
Use evidence to make decisions. All of the points that my colleagues have raised are correct. We need to be picking the right projects to ensure that those benefits, that the more diverse mixed-use types of communities, the infrastructure that serves those communities and enables people to move around are being fulfilled. We must be using evidence to make decisions at a time when money is scarce and the choices have very significant consequences.
So great to have representatives from three of Toronto's great universities here with us this evening on TVO. Next time we'll get OCAD-U in on this as well. Murtaza Haider from the Ryerson University, Maddie Simiaticki from the University of Toronto, Sharina Hussain from York University. Good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Be safe and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.